Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of unexpected redemption, love, and hope for the future. Enjoy the story. Jake and Rusty, two homeless men scraping by on the outskirts of Los Angeles, couldn't believe their eyes. A sleek black Mercedes-Benz was slowly cruising along the edge of the city dump, looking as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. "Holy crap, Rusty. Would you look at that ride?" Jake whispered, elbowing his companion. Rusty squinted, his weathered face creasing with suspicion. "What's a fancy pants like that doing in our neck of the woods? Think he's lost?" Jake shook his head, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Nah, man, my money's on body disposal. Bet he's got a stiff in the trunk from some high-stakes poker game gone wrong." "Get real, Jake. This ain't the 90s, Rusty scoffed, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the approaching vehicle. The Mercedes finally came to a stop, and both men held their breath as the driver's door swung open. A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet evening air. "I can't take it anymore," the man barked into his phone. "I've been waiting and waiting, but she just keeps hanging on. What happened to your promises, huh?" Jake and Rusty exchanged wide-eyed glances. "No, I don't want excuses," the man continued, yanking open his trunk. "I'm not asking you to kill her, for Christ's sake, but you assured me this would be over in 6 months. It's been a year, and I'm sick of waiting." As he ranted, the man began tossing several expensive-looking bags onto the ground. The bags landed with heavy thuds, clearly full of something substantial. "Holy shit," Rusty breathed. "You don't think—" But Jake was already shaking his head. "Nah, man. No way he'd be dumb enough to dump a body right here in broad daylight. But whatever's in those bags, I bet it's valuable." They watched as the Mercedes peeled away, leaving behind a small mountain of discarded luggage. As soon as the coast was clear, Rusty made a beeline for the bags. "Jackpot," he crowed, unzipping the first one. "Designer clothes, Jake. We're gonna eat like kings tonight." But Jake was more interested in a heavy bag he'd picked up. Unzipping it carefully, he found it stuffed with papers, photo albums, and books. "Hey, Rusty," he called out. "I'm gonna take this one back to camp. Might be something interesting in here." Rusty, already dreaming of the booze he'd buy with his haul, waved him off. "Knock yourself out, bookworm. I'm off to the pawn shop." Back at their makeshift camp, Jake settled in by the fire and began leafing through the photo album. His heart nearly stopped when he came to the first picture. "No way," he breathed, staring at the familiar face smiling up at him from the glossy page. It can't be. But it was. The woman in the photo was younger, but Jake would recognize her anywhere. It was Catherine, the wife of the man he'd stolen from years ago. Memories he'd tried so hard to bury came flooding back. Jake remembered the day his world had shattered. His wife, Sarah, pale and trembling in her hospital gown, clutching his hand as the doctor delivered the devastating news. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," the doctor had said, his face grave. "Without this experimental treatment, your wife's chances of survival are minimal." Jake had felt the floor drop out from under him. "How much?" he'd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When the doctor quoted the astronomical sum, Jake's heart had sunk. It might as well have been $1 million. They didn't have that kind of money, not even close. He'd tried everything, begged banks for loans, pleaded with friends and family for help. But the cold, hard truth was that no one wanted to risk that kind of money on a long-shot medical treatment. In desperation, Jake had made a choice that would haunt him for years to come. He'd stolen the money from his boss, a wealthy businessman named Richard Green. Jake had been his personal assistant, trusted with access to accounts and private information. He'd wired the money directly to the hospital and turned himself in the very next day. The trial had been quick. Jake remembered Catherine Green approaching him outside the courtroom, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and compassion. "Why?" she'd asked simply. And Jake, with nothing left to lose, had told her everything. He'd seen the conflict in her eyes, watched as she'd tried to convince her husband to drop the charges. But Richard Green was not a forgiving man. 5 years in prison. That was the price Jake paid for his wife's life. But when he'd finally been released, eager to start over, he'd found that Sarah had moved on. She'd remarried, unable or unwilling to wait for a man she barely recognized anymore. Homeless and hopeless, Jake had drifted, eventually ending up on the streets of L.A. He'd vowed never to return to the world that had chewed him up and spit him out. Now, staring at Catherine Green's face in the photo album, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What twist of fate had brought her belongings here, to this dump on the edge of the city? Jake set aside the photo album and pulled out a thick notebook. Opening it, he realized it was a diary. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if written by someone who was ill. "My name is Catherine Green," the first entry read, "and I'm writing this because I have no one else to talk to." Jake's conscience pricked him. This was deeply personal stuff, but his curiosity won out, and he began to read, immersing himself in Catherine's world. The diary painted a picture of a lonely, trapped woman. Catherine had married young, to a man chosen more for his business acumen than any romantic connection. Richard Green had been charming at first, but over the years his true nature had emerged, cold, controlling, and utterly self-absorbed. Catherine wrote of her struggles with infertility, of Richard's increasing emotional distance, of her growing suspicion that he was unfaithful. But what truly broke Jake's heart were the entries about her failing health. "Another diagnosis today," one entry read. "It feels like my body is betraying me, one organ at a time. Richard seems more inconvenienced than concerned. Sometimes I wonder if he's hoping I'll just fade away." As Jake read on, he realized with growing horror that the man he'd overheard on the phone, the man who'd dumped these bags, must have been Richard Green, and he was waiting, impatiently, for his wife to die. "I can't let this happen," Jake muttered, closing the diary with a snap. "I've got to help her somehow." The next morning, Jake headed to a nearby convenience store and bought a newspaper with some of the change he'd scrounged up. He scanned the classified ads until he found what he was looking for, a small house for sale in a rural area outside the city. Using the wad of cash he'd found in one of Richard's discarded bags, which he justified as karmic retribution, Jake made his way to the address listed. The owner, a grizzled old farmer, eyed him suspiciously at first. But money talks, and soon Jake was the proud owner of a dilapidated country cottage. For the next week, Jake worked tirelessly, repairing and cleaning the little house. He used the leftover money to buy supplies, determined to create a safe haven for Catherine. Finally satisfied with his work, Jake knew it was time for the hardest part of his plan, convincing Catherine to trust him. Jake spent nearly 24 hours staking out the Green Mansion, waiting for Richard to leave. As night fell, he watched the man exit the house, dressed to the nines. Clearly, he was in for a long night of philandering. After waiting a bit longer to ensure the coast was clear, Jake cautiously approached the house. He quickly identified Catherine's window. It was the only one with a light still on. Taking a deep breath, he tapped gently on the glass. After a moment, a gaunt face appeared at the window, eyes widening in recognition and fear. Catherine hesitated, then slowly opened the window. "I remember you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the man Richard sent to prison. Have you come for revenge?" Jake shook his head emphatically. "No, Mrs. Green. Catherine, I'm here to help you." He quickly explained about finding her belongings, reading her diary, and his plan to get her away from Richard. "I have a small house in the country," he finished. "Clean air, peace and quiet. It's yours if you want it. You can't stay here, Catherine. It's killing you." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, conflict clear on her face. "And if your clean air doesn't help? Everyone says I have one foot in the grave already." Jake met her gaze steadily. "Then at least we tried. Isn't that better than waiting here to die?" A spark of something, hope, maybe, or defiance, flickered in Catherine's eyes. She glanced back at her sparse, sterile room, then turned to Jake with a nod. "All right," she said softly. "I'll come with you." The little cottage looked like something out of a fairy tale in the soft morning light. Catherine's eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she breathed, slipping off her shoes to feel the cool grass between her toes. "I haven't walked barefoot since I was a little girl." Jake watched her, a warm feeling spreading in his chest. For the first time since he'd known her, Catherine looked truly alive. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of the front gate creaking open. A robust woman in her 70s, though she looked a decade younger, bustled in carrying a heavy basket. "Well, hello there, young'uns," she called out cheerfully. "I'm Mildred, but everyone round here calls me Millie. I'm your nearest neighbor, about a mile down the road. Thought I'd bring over some victuals to welcome you proper." Catherine looked overwhelmed by the whirlwind that was Millie, but Jake stepped in smoothly. "That's awfully kind of you, Millie. We appreciate it." Millie set down her basket with a huff. "Well, you two get to sorting through that. I've got to get back to my chickens. Jake, you just holler if you need anything else, you hear?" As Millie bustled off, Catherine peered curiously into the basket. What did she bring? Jake grinned, already familiar with Millie's generosity. "Only the best home-cooked meal you've ever had in your life." Catherine's interest in food had waned over the years of illness, but as Jake unpacked Millie's basket, even she couldn't resist the mouth-watering aromas. They spent the evening on the porch, talking late into the night. Catherine shared stories of her lonely marriage, her fears for the future. Jake opened up about his time in prison, his regrets, and his hopes for redemption. As the stars twinkled overhead, Catherine turned to Jake with a soft smile. "You know, I think this might be the first real conversation I've had in years." Jake reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Well, here's to many more." Over the next few months, a remarkable transformation took place. With clean air, good food, and freedom from the constant stress of her old life, Catherine's health began to improve. Color returned to her cheeks, and she gained back some of the weight she'd lost. Jake found himself falling for this new Catherine, strong, vibrant, and full of life. But he held back, not wanting to complicate their friendship or take advantage of her vulnerability. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset, Catherine turned to Jake with a serious expression. "Jake," she said softly, "I need to know something. Why did you really help me? You could have taken that money and disappeared. Why risk everything for me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped, Catherine. To feel like you're dying inside while everyone around you goes on with their lives. When I read your diary, I saw a chance to do something good, to maybe balance out some of the mistakes I've made." He paused, then added quietly, "And because I think you're one of the strongest, most beautiful people I've ever met, you deserved a chance at real happiness." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Slowly, she leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to Jake's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me my life back." Almost a year to the day after Jake had rescued Catherine from her gilded cage, they received an unexpected visitor. A police car pulled up to the cottage, and a serious-looking officer stepped out. "Catherine Green?" he called out. Catherine, who had been tending to her flourishing garden, straightened up with a mix of apprehension and determination on her face. "Yes, that's me." The officer's stern expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, we've been looking for you for quite some time. Your husband reported you missing, presumed dead." Jake tensed, ready to defend their life together, but Catherine placed a calming hand on his arm. "Well, as you can see, officer, I'm very much alive," she said with a wry smile. "In fact, I'm healthier than I've been in years." The officer nodded. "Be that as it may, ma'am, there are some legal matters that need to be addressed. Would you be willing to come down to the station to make a statement?" Catherine exchanged a look with Jake, then nodded. "Of course, but I have a few statements of my own to make while we're there." The scene at the lawyer's office was tense. Richard Green paced back and forth like a caged animal, his face red with frustration. "What kind of laws are these?" he ranted at the impassive lawyer. "My wife disappeared a year ago. She was deathly ill. It's obvious she can't still be alive. How long do I have to wait before I can move on with my life?" The lawyer shrugged. "I don't make the laws, Mr. Green. I just enforce them." Suddenly, the office door swung open. Richard whirled around, ready to bark at the intruder, but the words died in his throat. There stood Catherine, looking healthier and more vibrant than she had in years. At her side was Jake, his protective stance making it clear that he and Catherine were more than just friends. "Hello, Richard," Catherine said coolly. Surprise. Richard's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, anger. "Where the hell have you been?" he sputtered. Catherine's laugh was devoid of humor. "Recovering, living, all the things I couldn't do under your roof." She turned to the lawyer. "I'm glad you're here. I need your help drafting divorce papers. Oh, and we'll need to discuss the transfer of my father's company back into my name." Richard's face paled. "You can't do that," he hissed. "That company is mine." "Actually," the lawyer interjected, "according to your father-in-law's will, the company remains in Catherine's name, unless she willingly transfers ownership, which I'm guessing she never did." Catherine shook her head, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. "No, I never did. Funny how all those papers you had me sign when I was too sick to handle the stress of business turned out to be ineffective, isn't it, Richard?" As the reality of his situation sank in, Richard slumped into a chair, all his bluster gone. Catherine turned to Jake, her eyes soft. "Ready to go home?" Jake nodded, taking her hand. As they left the office, Catherine felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly free. A year later, the little cottage had been transformed. An extension had been added, the garden had exploded into a riot of color, and the sound of laughter frequently filled the air. Catherine, now officially Catherine Thompson, sat on the porch swing, her hand resting on her slightly swollen belly. Jake came out to join her, passing her a glass of Millie's famous lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, settling in beside her. Catherine smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in 2 years. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life." Jake wrapped an arm around her, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "Having second thoughts?" he teased gently. She swatted his arm playfully. "Never. I've never been happier." Her expression grew more serious. "I was thinking about the foundation, actually. We're making real progress." After her divorce from Richard, Catherine had used a significant portion of her reclaimed wealth to start a foundation aimed at helping victims of domestic abuse and providing medical care for those who couldn't afford it. It was her way of paying forward the second chance she'd been given. Jake nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "The new shelter in the city is almost ready to open, and the free clinic is already overflowing with patients." "We're making a difference," Catherine said softly. "All those years I felt powerless. I never imagined I could do something like this." Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're the strongest person I know, Catherine. You can do anything you set your mind to." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the couple sat entwined on their porch swing, marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them together. From the depths of despair, a prison cell, a loveless marriage, they had found each other and, in doing so, had found redemption, love, and hope for the future. Inside the cottage, on a shelf in their cozy living room, sat 2 items that served as constant reminders of their journey: a worn leather diary, its pages filled with pain and longing, and a faded photo album, capturing moments of a life long past. These relics of their former lives now stood as testaments to how far they'd come and the bright future that lay ahead. As night fell and crickets began their evening chorus, Jake and Catherine Thompson headed inside, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, together.